like to welcome those of you in Calvert City and Eddyville and those worshiping with us at the Paducah campus. God is doing some great things in the life of Four Rivers Church during this series. We come to the final day of Flashmob, and some folks I think are still kind of getting what we mean by Flashmob. So let me throw out a reminder. A Flashmob is an immediate thing where an individual invites a group of people to join them in doing something. They do it, and then they're done. Okay, it's just a quick get-together. So you might find it on college campuses or in towns all over America. Most of the time, it's fairly meaningless stuff, like let's gather around something and dance for a minute, and then we're done. We've been redefining flash mobs so that we're challenging the people of Four Rivers Church to see a need, meet a need together. That's the theme. So throughout the church, would you guys join with me in saying those three things? Let's say that out loud. You guys, everybody together. See a need, meet a need together. That's a flash mob. We worship Jesus by worshiping like Jesus, and Jesus 6 times in the New Testament caused a scene in things that we call the Sabbath controversies, where he saw a need and he met a need on the Sabbath. And the 4-point sermon of all 6 of those stories is this: Jesus sees a need, Jesus meets a need, Jesus is offensive to someone and they get onto him for it, and then Jesus explains himself, and about half of the time he does so in kind of a strong way. Okay, so he fights back. So that's basically, if I taught all 6 of those stories, it would be the same 4-point sermon every week. Jesus sees a need, meets a need, they get mad at him, he gets even with them. That's kind of how that works. And tonight's story is no different than that. So, but before we go there, I just want to ask you a couple of questions. How many of you would say, I like a good fight? Like, honestly, let's be honest. You kind of enjoy a good fight. Come on, I all throughout the church, hands up. I know there are more of you. How many of you are lying right now and not raising your hand? Okay, so listen, in a world of mixed martial arts, makeup sex, fight clubs, fight crime, fight the good fight, the Fight for Life, Fight Magazine, The Ultimate Fighter, and now there's even a new website called GoogleFight.com, which you all have to try. It's a lot of fun. GoogleFight.com is by Google. You put in 2 different Google searches and search them, and it tells you which of the 2 has more hits. Okay, and there's this whole cartoon where they fight each other, and it's really funny. But fighting is in our culture. In pop culture, fighting is in. It's very popular. Okay, and so I want to talk to you about fighting. Now, before we talk about it, I know some of you are thinking, we're in church. The topic is fighting. Brad is going to teach us about patience and kindness and forgiveness and love and joy and tranquility, and we're all going to meditate and pray for our enemies and that kind of thing. That's what we're going to do. But actually, no, that's not what I'm going to talk to you about. Those are all good things, and there's a different day and a different time for those sermons. But in this particular series, I want to tell you that many times Jesus actually picks a fight. He does. That doesn't sound very Jesus-like, does it, to pick a fight? But if you read the scriptures carefully, you'll see on a regular basis there are several different occasions in which Jesus is so concerned about something that someone is doing that he just genuinely picks a fight with them. Here are some things that Jesus says. Read these with me if you would. These are Matthew 5:20 is the first one. But I warn you, unless you obey God better than the teachers of religious law and the Pharisees do, you can't enter the kingdom of heaven at all. Okay, that doesn't sound like he's picking a fight unless you're a religious teacher or a Pharisee, right? And then he just smacked you and said something about your mama. You know what I mean? Like he's picking a fight. In Matthew 6:5, he says, and now about prayer. When you pray, don't pray like hypocrites do, who pray publicly on street corners and in the synagogues where everyone can see them. I assure you that is all the reward they will ever get. Once again, he's picking a fight. I mean, that's not nice, Jesus, is it? I mean, that's pretty straightforward and direct. Then I love this one. Matthew 23, 1 through 3, and I'm reading this from a translation called The Message, which is it's like the Thug Bible. You know what I mean? It's like I like it a lot. I like it a whole lot, but it's just very street language. Okay, it's good. If you don't have one, you should get one. It says in Matthew 23, 1 through 3. Now Jesus turned to address his disciples. along with the crowd that had gathered with them. The religious scholars and the Pharisees are competent teachers in God's law. He says that they are competent teachers in God's law. You won't go wrong in following their teachings on Moses. They're all thinking, Jesus is saying something nice about me. How nice, but he's setting them up to pick a fight. Watch what he says. But be careful about following them. They talk a good line, but they don't live it. They don't take it into their hearts and live it out in their behavior. It's all spit and polish veneer. Thus the Thug Bible quote. Okay, so in other words, it's all on the outside. It's all plastic. It's not real. These guys are not who they say they are. They're not even who they say you should be. Okay? Jesus is picking a fight with them. In Mark 7, verses 5 and 6, he says, so the Pharisees and teachers of religious law asked him, why don't your disciples follow our age-old customs, for they eat without performing their hand-washing ceremony. And Jesus replied, it's just 2 words, exclamation point at the end, you hypocrite. I don't know about you, but I don't know anybody in my life I can look at and go, you're a hypocrite. And they're not going to want to fight me afterwards. You know what I'm saying? I mean, that's like, there are a few things in Livingston County you don't call people. You know, you don't call them a liar. You know what I'm saying? You don't call them a hypocrite, and you don't talk about their mama. That's the things that you don't do unless you want to scrap. I mean, that's just the rules of the road, you know? And so I'm just saying, let's not picture in our mind a Jesus who is simply passive, easy, sweet, and kind all the time. That's all he is in a lot of people's minds. The Jesus that we love and the Jesus that we follow chooses to pick fights occasionally. He really does. And so I think we better share him as he is. We better teach him as he is. Jesus picks fights with the well-educated, heavily empowered religious leaders of his day for their blatant disregard for God's greatest creation, for their blatant disregard for God's most precious creation, and that is human beings. They care about rules. They care about guidelines. They care about structure. They care about order. They care about looking good, but they don't care about people. And for that, Jesus is willing to fight. In fact, if you think about, those of you who've read maybe some of the New Testament, if you think about the kinds of people that Jesus encountered prostitutes. Jesus encountered the equivalent to the drug dealer for his day and time, okay? Jesus encountered the equivalent to the mob for his day and time, that would be the tax collector. Jesus encountered all of these different kinds of people. Jesus encountered people who had diseases that their culture had said are direct curses from God, the way in our world some people treat AIDS victims and others. Jesus encountered people who were just simply discarded by society, and yet not once did he ever pick a fight with any of them. Not once did he pick a fight with a prostitute. Not once did he pick a fight with the guy who stole everybody's money. Not once did he pick a fight with those. And yet we see him repeatedly, over and over again, pick a fight with the guys who went to church every Sunday, or the Saturday at that time. He picked a fight with the folks who did what the rules said they were supposed to do, because no matter how many rules they followed, in the long run, they didn't care about people. Jesus is setting up a story where he's about to die for them. This is my favorite quote of the sermon. Jesus picks a fight with the culturally innocent on behalf of the culturally guilty. That's weird and strange and countercultural and doesn't make sense, but that is the Jesus of the New Testament. I mean, in today's society, Christian leaders, sometimes, we pick fights with homosexuals and Muslims and hip-hop, rock star, country stars, and, Democratic presidents and all different kinds of folks like that Christian leaders in our world pick fights with. Jesus picked fights with religious leaders. That's who he wants to fight with. He picked fights with the Pharisees. So tonight's message is called Picking Fights with Pharisees. That's my title, Picking Fights with Pharisees. I wrote this for me because this is an area of learning that I greatly need. I got to tell you, before I get to bring you this topic, I have to really spend some time thinking about this topic, because I have a tendency to want to pick a fight with the wrong person. I just want to ask, throughout the church, Calvert City, Eddyville, Paducah, any of us, how many of you would say, I have picked a fight with the wrong person before, and I just picked a fight with the wrong people sometimes. Okay, what about this one? I have not picked a fight with someone I probably should have in the past. Anybody say I probably missed out on a fight I should have picked? Okay, well, let's do this. We're going to look at the scripture and read through a story that is a moment when Jesus picks a fight, and we're going to learn some things about picking a fight with Pharisees, okay? Picking the kind of fights that Jesus would pick. We're in John chapter 5. And before I start reading this, I want to tell you a little bit of Bible background with the book of John. In the book of John, it's different than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You know, there are 4 gospel stories, 4 biographies of Jesus, okay? Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very similar. Those guys, in fact, historically, theologians and Bible scholars will tell us that Mark was written first, and then Matthew and Luke used Mark as a commentary for writing. It was almost like they used Mark as their notes. So Mark is the shortest, and Matthew and Luke are more detailed. Okay, so if you could imagine them going, oh, I remember when that happened, but I remember this other thing that Mark didn't include. And so they start writing in additional details from their memory. So you have Matthew, Mark, and Luke that are like 85% the same book. Just very, very similar. But then John's the oddball. John didn't read any of those in preparation, or at least you can't tell from his writing. John wrote from his own experience. He was a follower of Christ. He was one of the disciples. He was beloved by Jesus. And John writes with a different desire. John writes to a group of people later in history, 70 or 80, maybe even 90 AD. This is pretty late in the early first 100 years of the church. And during that time, John writes, and John has a goal. John wants to convince people that Jesus is God. That's kind of that's it. In fact, he's the one who, if you read John 1:1, says, in the beginning there was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning, talking about Jesus. So he tells us his mission statement for the book there in the very first verse. Throughout the first 11 chapters of John, he gives us several signs from God that Jesus was the Son of God. He gives us several of them. The first 2, he calls them the first sign, which was the turning of water into wine, and the second sign, and then the story I'm going to read to you is the third sign that Jesus was the Son of God. So not only is it a story where Jesus picks a fight with a Pharisee, but it's also a sign from God, according to John, that this Jesus is the Son of God, is God in the flesh, here to save us. I'm going to start reading from the first verse. John chapter 5, verse 1. Afterward, Jesus returned to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish holy days. Inside the city, near the sheep gate, was the pool of Bethesda, with 5 covered porches. Crowds of sick people. I'm going to tell you before I read this verse is going to open up a bunch of questions, like what does that mean, and how did that happen, and where does that come from? I'm not going to tell you tonight, but I'm not going to tell you today, but I'm just telling you that's another sermon, okay? Crowds of sick people, blind, lame, and paralyzed, laid on the porches. One of the men lying there had been sick for 38 years. When Jesus saw him and knew he had been ill for a long time, he asked him, "Would you like to be well? Would you like to get well?" And the man says, "I can't, sir," the sick man said, "for I have no one to put me into the pool when the water bubbles up." That's the part that I'm not really going to spend a lot of time explaining yet. He says, every time I try to get into the water where healing happens, every time I try, someone else gets there ahead of me. Okay, so without going into the deep theological background, what we have here is a group of sick people sitting around a pool of water, and they believe that occasionally this water starts moving and bubbling, and the first person in the water gets healed. Okay, that's what they believe. I call shotgun, whichever one gets in first, they get to walk now, okay? The sad part of the story is that this man can't walk at all and has no strength in his lower body. He simply cannot get to the water. I've wondered, why doesn't he sit right on the edge and just fall in? I don't understand the process, but he just doesn't. So he's on his mat, he's laying on the ground, and the sad part of the story is that every time he wants to get in the water, someone beats him there. Someone with a different kind of ailment, someone who might have withered arms but can run. Someone pushes him out of the way and they get in front of him. So we have in our story here the person for whom Jesus is about to pick a fight. Jesus is about to pick a fight for this man. Now, do you remember I told you earlier that Jesus picks a fight with Pharisees because Pharisees don't care about people? Okay, that's they don't love God, they don't love people, they love rules, laws, and looking good. That's what they like, okay? This is a man who no one has been loving. No one picks him up, puts him in the pool. No one gives him assistance. He is proverbially the man at the back of the line, okay? Every line. Every line in his life that matters, he's at the back of it. So the first point, if you will, today is that Jesus wants us to pick fights for people at the back of the line. Okay? And in our lives, we need to find ways to find people who are at the back of the line culturally, who are at the back of the line financially, at the back of the line spiritually, at the back of the line socially. People who have been pushed aside, pushed back, stepped over, stepped on, and put at the back of the line. God cares about those people, and He's calling us to pick a fight for them. I don't know if you know this or not, but if you have the ability to fight for yourself, you ought to be thankful that you have the ability to take care of yourself. You have the ability to handle things. There are folks in our world that for whatever various reason may not have the same ability to take care of or fight for themselves that you and I do. And it's not like, in their world, here's what the Pharisees would have said. The Pharisees would have said, well, they must have sinned. God is cursing them. If they starve, that's God chose that. You know, big deal. I'm a good guy. I don't starve. They're a bad guy. They starve. That's ridiculous, isn't it? It's ridiculous. Jesus teaches us to fight for the person at the back of the line. So I would ask you today to think about in your life, who do you know that's at the back of the line? Or the challenge I have to ask myself, do I spend so much time at the front of the line that I've never met anybody at the back of the line? Do I spend so much time at the front of the line that I would not know a back of the line person if I was around them? I would find my way in front of them. On a regular basis, if you are an achiever, a hard worker, a fast mover, a shake and baker, you know what I mean? We tend to find ourselves getting to the water before other people do. And the problem with that is that we don't get a chance to pick a fight for the man or the woman at the back of the line, okay? Let me keep reading. Jesus told him in verse 8, stand up, pick up your mat. That's important. Stand up, pick up your mat, okay? Would you say that with me, everybody together? Stand up, pick up your mat, and walk. That's what he says. We'll talk about why that's important in a minute. Instantly, the man was healed. Instantly. Jesus says, stand up, pick up your mat, and walk. And instantly, the man can do it. Jesus gives the man at the back of the line what he needs to no longer be at the back of the line. Okay? That's really important. He rolled up his sleeping mat and he began walking. But, and John is about to tell us, this miracle happened on the Sabbath. This miracle happened on the Sabbath. So the Jewish leaders objected. Can you see where this is about to go? They said to the man who was cured, you can't work on the Sabbath. The law does not allow you to carry that sleeping mat. In our world and culture, we're like, what? I don't get it. I don't get it. I mean, we've already talked about the fact that the Jewish leaders had developed hundreds and hundreds of laws and rules trying to define what was rest and what was work and trying to make sure that people don't do what they're not supposed to do on the Sabbath. Like we said earlier, if you remember, that a legalist will always take a blessing from God and turn it into a burden from God. They'll always do that. Take something that was meant from a gift and they'll give it a price tag. You know what I mean? That it was meant to be free. It was meant to be blessing. It was meant to be love. And they'll take it and they'll make it into work. They'll make it into challenge. They'll make it into burden. They'll make it heavy. They've done this with the Sabbath in this story, and Jesus is rescuing the Sabbath from them. He's capturing the Sabbath from them, and he's teaching us not just to pick a fight for the ones at the back of the line, but in this case, he's teaching us to pick a fight for the ones who are always put down by the strong, those whose weakness is put down by the strong. I don't know if you caught it, but let me tell you what Jesus did. Jesus said, stand up and walk. Isn't that what he said? Did he say something else? Stand up. What? Calvary City, what did he say? Stand up, pick up your mat, and walk. Jesus just picked a fight. If he had said, stand up and walk, leave the old nasty mat on the ground, no Jewish leaders are going to fight with him about anything. The man just gets up and walks off. You can do that, okay? But he says, stand up, pick up the mat, and walk. And the moment the man picks up the mat, the Jewish leaders are blowing a whistle, calling time out, saying that's a foul. Okay? Jesus encouraged him to break one of the rules. Jesus did something that he knew would set the Pharisees off. And they do. Jesus picks a fight just by saying, pick up the mat. Pick up the mat. That's like meeting somebody out church and going, put your hat on. Just put your hat on, go on in there. You know, just do it. I want to see what happens. You know, just like, you know, here's an air horn. Use that during worship. I just want to see what happens if they do, you know, here, take that in there. Yeah, here, wear the halter top. I don't care, you know, just do that. No, don't. I'm just like, I'm just kidding. But, you know, it's like he's saying, I want you to do what is going to get you in trouble with the religious people. And let's just see where this goes. Okay, I can just like, do you see how this is Jesus picking a fight? He is. And here's what happens. So the Jewish leaders objected. They said to the man who was cured, you can't work on the Sabbath. The law doesn't allow you to carry your mat. Blah, blah, blah. So in verse 11, but he replied, the man did. He says, the man who healed me told me to pick up my mat and walk. Okay. In other words, you, Mr. Pharisee, religious leader, know all about the Old Testament. You've been watching me in my difficult nature for 30 some odd years. This one guy comes up, tells me to pick up my mat and walk, and I can. I'm going to do it. I don't care what you say. Okay, I care what he says. That's pretty much what he's getting at. And then they demanded, who said such a thing as that? And the fight is on, right? Who talked about my mama? The man didn't know, for Jesus had disappeared into the crowd, and he did not give the man his name. He disappeared into the crowd. And then, again, is Jesus picking a fight? But afterward, Jesus found out about the conversation. Jesus found the man in the temple and told him, now you are well, so stop sinning. This is weird. Stop sinning, or even something worse is going to happen to you. Makes you wonder what the man did to hurt himself. Jesus obviously knows and doesn't want him to do it again. Okay, like don't go ride the mountain bike that fast anymore. Okay, you already broke the ankle a bunch. Don't do it anymore. That's okay. And then the man went and told the Jewish leaders that it was Jesus who had healed him. Okay, I'm sure this is probably not what's going on in Jesus' mind, but my imagination just works this way. It's as if Jesus picks a fight. He heals the man. He says, pick up your mat. I know what that's going to lead to. And he walks off. The man picks up his mat. The Pharisees come over and go, who told you to pick up your mat? And the guy goes, I didn't catch his name. And it's almost like Jesus goes, I forgot to tell him my name. I can't pick a fight if I didn't tell him who I am to fight with. So Jesus goes back and goes, my name is Jesus, and leaves so that he'll go and tell the guy what his name is so that they can then have the disagreement. You know what I'm saying? That's really what seems to be happening in this story. The man went back to them and told them that his name was Jesus. So in verse 16, so the Jewish leaders began harassing Jesus for breaking the Sabbath rules. He picked a fight, he got a fight. That's what's happening. Jesus replied, my Father is always working, and so am I. Do you see how, to a Jewish scholar, the men and women who live off of a God worked 6 days and rested on the seventh, and the Sabbath is a rest day, how when Jesus says, my Father is always working, and so am I, do you see how offensive that is to their religious worldview? In verse 18 says, so the Jewish leaders tried all the harder to find a way to kill him. For not only did he break the Sabbath, that was his first big sin in their eyes, in their definition of that, he then called God his Father, thereby making himself equal with God. Jesus' breaking of their Sabbath rules, that's one of the two reasons why they chose to crucify him. This is a big deal in their culture and their world, and it should redefine for us, if we're Christ followers, it redefines for us what Sabbath means in many ways. Sabbath's not always about rest now. Jesus says, my Father's always working, and so am I. I'm always looking for something to do, always looking for some way to benefit someone else. I'm always looking for a need so that I can meet a need, and in His church together. So the third thing I'm going to add is a bit of a twist. It's easy for us to get all excited about picking a fight. I think I could be very motivating as a leader, and I think I could point out something in our community that's pharisaical, and I could say, let's go kick its behind. Like, let's go whip that. Let's go do that. In fact, early on in my ministry, I think I did that. I think I picked certain kinds of churches and certain types of Christians and certain behaviors that I saw in church, and I was like, let's go pop that in the mouth. Let's do that. And people were very motivated, and they liked fight it. Like, yeah, let's do that. Especially young men really like to go pop something in the mouth. They're really into that on behalf of God. Praise the Lord. So the problem is, I think I may have missed something then, and I don't want to miss it now. And that is this: if we're going to pick a fight with Pharisees, okay? If I'm going to pick a fight with a Pharisee, if you're going to pick a fight with a Pharisee, if we're going to pick the fights that Jesus picks, then we're not just going to pick the fight on behalf of people, like we've talked about so far today, but we're also going to pick a fight with the Pharisee in us. You see, Jesus did not have any Pharisee in Him, but Brad Henson does. Jesus did not have any tendencies to think of Himself as better than others, or wonder why someone else just doesn't get it done right, or wonder why someone else has messed their life up, or Jesus doesn't have this desire to think of Himself as better than somebody else. Jesus doesn't have this desire to care about stuff more than He cares about people. Jesus does not have an inner Pharisee, but Brad Henson can, And I'm not going to say everybody's name who is hearing the sermon, but you can too, We can have an inner Pharisee. So let's not leave this series about redefining the Sabbath and seeing a need and meeting a need, and occasionally in the process of doing so, maybe even picking a fight on behalf of someone. Let's not do that without first being the kind of people who are willing to pick a fight with the Pharisee that lives in here. Because that Pharisee can be alive and well. In the book of Luke, Jesus says He's teaching His disciples, who He's about to send out to go pick a fight, with the devil, lots of different things. He's sending them out, but He says this. He says, how can you think of saying, friend, let me help you get rid of that speck in your eye, when the problem is you can't see past the log in your own eye? Hypocrite, Jesus says again, hypocrite, first get rid of the log in your own eye, and then you will see well enough to deal with the speck in your friend's eye. Okay, speck in an eye, let's not overlook this. Help me remember, what did Jesus' father do for a living? He was a carpenter. Okay, carpenter. When I was a kid, one of my babysitters, her husband was a woodworker as a hobby. He made clocks, made beautiful hardwood clocks, cherry and oak and maple and things. And one of the cool things I would get to do is occasionally he would let me go into his woodworking, his garage, where he had all these different things. And something I'll never forget, when he's been in there working and there's very little ventilation and there's saws chopping and cutting, and he wore this big white thing over his face and these big goggles when he worked, but little Brad just walks in there like just came in from kindergarten, and I'm here, and I remember that the air was thick with sawdust. It was fine, and it was everywhere, and it would clog to your hair, and it would, even at a young age, I used a lot of gel, so it would like stick, there, and it would get in your eyes, and I would remember, this feeling of getting this stuff in my eyes, and I can't get it out. So the son of a carpenter, a boy who's been around this kind of thing a lot, now become a man, when he says, don't look at the speck in someone else's eye without dealing with the log in your own. This is a very alive and well metaphor for this son of a carpenter, okay, to use. Jesus is just saying this: don't pick a fight with a Pharisee unless you pick a fight with your own inner Pharisee first. Don't do that. Don't pick a fight with somebody else who's hurting people if you haven't picked a fight with the guy in you who hurts people. You know, don't pick a fight with the sin in somebody else's life until you deal with the sin in your own. Don't pick a fight out there until you've picked a fight in here. Okay? How about this? Don't spend all of your Christian life looking at needs to be met out there without also dealing with the needs to be met in here. Calvert City, Eddyville, Paducah, are we people who pick a fight with the Pharisee that lives inside of us? Because if we're not, then we might be on a different team than we think we are in this fight. We might really, really need to repent. Here are some things that Jesus says about, that the Bible says about discipline in your own life when it comes to dealing with your own inner Pharisee, okay? Proverbs 10:17 says, people who accept discipline are on the path to life, but those who ignore correction will go astray. It's a straightforward, good passage right there. Jeremiah 10:24 says, so correct me, Lord. I love this. So correct me, Lord, but please be gentle. Do not correct me in anger, for I would die. In other words, I want to deal with my stuff before God has to deal with my stuff. Let me get rid of it now before God has to get mad at me and get rid of it. Proverbs 12:1 says, to learn, you must love discipline. It is stupid to hate correction. So here's the idea I have for this week. I want to challenge us to do a different kind of flash mob. Not a kind of flash mob where I focus all of my attention on someone else's need and I get my buddies to go with me and we go help deal with somebody else's need. That is a very important flash mob, and I hope you do 100 of them in the next few months, okay? I hope I'm invited to as many of them as you do, and I hope I get to come to a bunch of them. So we're going to do that kind of flash mob like crazy all the time. But sometimes we need a different kind of flash mob. Instead of being external, we need to be internal. I need to send a text message to 5 or 6 of my buddies and say, would you guys go out to lunch with me and talk to me about my inner Pharisee? I want to confess my sins to you. I want to share with you my challenges. I want to let you know where I'm hurting. I want to let you know where I'm frustrated. I want to let you know where I'm weak. I want you to let me know where I'm weak. I want you to let me know where I'm struggling. I want you to let me know, you see what I'm saying, where I need correction. When we do that, when we, instead of staying away from correction, when we fear correction, if we embrace it, if we invite it, if we encourage it, the Bible tells us that we will learn, that we will grow, that we will become more like God, and that we will be a true disciple of Christ. Would you pray with me?